All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the second video for the nitrogen cycle. I could have added this to the first video, but I kind of didn't want to get too long-winded with it. So this one, yesterday or in the last video, we discussed, just the process of the nitrogen cycle. Again, I would highly suggest watching that maybe a couple of times and really reviewing that diagram so that we understand all the different processes that are involved. It's going to take studying it, not just looking at it. There's a difference between looking at your notes and studying your notes. So really study that diagram and learn from it. All right. So this in this little lecture here, I just want to briefly discuss some of the human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. And there's a list here of like 6 or 7 things, but the only 2 that I want to focus on today are these last 2. Now, these other ones, nitric oxide, nitrogen, we'll talk about those when we get into our unit on air pollution. Mining, we'll talk about that when we get into our unit about mining. Municipal sewage, we'll talk about that when we talk about water pollution. But these last 2 here, the HaberBosch process and dead zones, I think these are 2 kind of good topics to discuss at this point in our course. So let's first talk about the Haber process or the HaberBosch process. There's a scientist named Fritz Haber. I believe he was German. I don't remember. But anyway, he was around in the early 1900s. And his kind of claim to fame was that he came up with a chemical equation to generate or to create ammonia synthetically, like in a lab. Okay, if you go back, I'm going to go back real quick to the cycle. Oops, where are you at, cycle? There you are. You guys might remember this right here, ammonia. Okay, according to our nitrogen cycle, the only way that we can get ammonia is if it gets fixed by nitrogen. So this process kind of takes a while. It's not like it's an instantaneous thing. For ammonia to build up in the soil, it takes a while. It doesn't take like millions of years, but it takes some time. So Fritz Haber, going back to him real quick, Fritz Haber wanted to know if there was a way that synthetically we can generate ammonia much quicker. And he figured out that there was. If we can figure out a way to take nitrogen gas and combine it with hydrogen gas, which is also in our atmosphere, if we can combine those 2 things together somehow industrially, then we can produce this, which is ammonia. Now, what this eventually led to, trying to make a long story short, is it eventually led to a mass amount of ammonia being able to be produced in industry. We can now, because of this equation, we can now produce tons and tons of synthetic ammonia every single day. It's the main ingredient in fertilizers. So if, for example, your dad fertilizes your lawn, or your dad goes to Home Depot and buys a bag of Scott's fertilizer, the main ingredient in that is ammonia. And that's all created because of Fritz Haber's equation. Okay, that's why it's kind of important. Now, it's so important that if we couldn't produce ammonia synthetically, there would be no way we can feed everybody on this planet. Remember, we've got about 7.8 billion people. Without synthetic fertilizer, we would only be able to feed about 4 billion people, and that's a problem. In the early 1900s, when Fritz Haber first, designed came up with his equation, there was only about 1.5 billion people on Earth. Today, 7.8 billion. So a lot of people attribute Fritz Haber's equation and the Fritz Haber process or the HaberBosch process of generating ammonia as one of the things that really triggered this population explosion that we saw throughout the entire decade or not decade, century of the 1900s. You know, if Fritz Haber wouldn't have came up with that equation, and we could make a bunch of synthetic fertilizer, there probably wouldn't be 7.8 billion people on the planet today. I mean, so it's a good thing, I guess, that we can feed people, but maybe it's a bad thing that we can feed people. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because now, partially because of this thing, we've got a lot more people on this planet, and we got to keep feeding them. So it's becoming kind of an issue, the population explosion. Another problem with all of this excess ammonia, all this excess fertilizer that gets used. It says here, of all the synthetic fertilizers that's put into the soil, only about 50% of it actually gets converted into nitrates so it can be absorbed by plants. So the rest of it, where does it go? It ends up in lakes. It ends up into groundwater supplies. We talked about the water cycle, right? So as water moves its way across the surface, it picks up all this extra ammonia, and eventually it ends up in lakes, rivers, and streams, and that could lead to this, right? We've just got done talking about eutrophication. Eutrophication occurs when excess nutrients, things like nitrates and phosphate, which we'll talk about the phosphorus cycle, when those things get into water, it causes algae to bloom, right? So, I mean, look at this picture on the left over here. We see all that green on the top of that pond or that lake. That's all algae. And that's pretty much an indicator that those algae have everything that they need to grow, right? Remember, nitrogen is a limiting resource. So if they got plenty of nitrogen, those algae can probably just bloom out of control, which is probably what you're seeing there, right? Now, one of the problems with excess nitrogen in the water is we get all those algae, right? And eventually algae are going to die. I mean, all these algae that are on top of this pond, I mean, they're eventually going to die. So when they die, they get decomposed. They get broken down by bacteria. So the bacteria are going to eat the algae. But those bacteria, they actually use oxygen. Remember I talked about decomposers use up oxygen? So what ends up happening is you get a lake that ends up being stripped of all of its oxygen. So then the fish can't breathe, right? And the fish end up dying. You see a lot of dead fish in the lake or dead fish in the pond. We have a special name for that. It's called a dead zone or a hypoxic dead zone. Hypoxia is basically when there's no oxygen available, or the oxygen's been removed or used up, and now there's nothing left for the fish in this case. All right, so this is a really important slide here. I want you to look over this a couple times and kind of listen to what I said about this process of eutrophication. This could happen naturally, but it could also happen culturally, like people can cause this to happen. But make sure we understand this. This is a good picture here. This is the state of Louisiana. And one thing, if you're not too familiar with Louisiana, there is a major river that makes its way out and eventually drains out into the Gulf of Mexico, and that's the Mississippi River. Mississippi River, if you think about it, it travels all the way through the Midwestern part of the U.S. In fact, it starts all the way up there in like Lake Superior, all the way through Minnesota, and then down to Illinois, and through all of these states, and eventually it drains out. But think about all the rivers that flow into the Mississippi River, and think about all the farmland that's around those rivers, and think about all the fertilizer that might make its way into all those rivers. And guess where it's all going to drain out? It's all going to drain out right in here. Okay. Now there's a current that flows all along this southern part of Louisiana. So all the drainage that comes out over here, it actually kind of moves its way over here. And what you're seeing is basically a gigantic dead zone. Those areas in red are areas where the oxygen level is so low that most of the fish aren't even there anymore. I mean, if you're a fisherman, good luck making your living in these areas in red, okay? Because those areas are pretty much fishless, all because of the hypoxia that's happened in this area. One interesting thing about it is the size of this dead zone, which is like 5,000 square miles. It actually does fluctuate. It actually gets bigger and smaller depending on the time of the year. When you think about it, like in the wintertime, this will actually get smaller because in the wintertime, all those states, up above Louisiana, it's cold for the most part, and they're not using a lot of fertilizers in the wintertime, so that water down here may have a lot less nitrates in it. But in the summertime, it tends to get a lot bigger, obviously. So keep that in mind. Last thing here, this is called blue baby syndrome. We've been finding that there's been a disease, or it's a syndrome. It's an inborn thing that, or not inborn, but kids are being born with it. It's all caused by nitrogen in the drinking water, and the mothers will drink the contaminated water, and that ends up getting into the baby's cells and the baby's tissues, and the babies are born with blood that is very difficult for their blood, like their red blood cells, to carry oxygen, all because of the nitrates that are in the water that eventually get into the baby's bloodstream. So this is kind of a bad thing. Like, we don't want to be drinking water that has too many nitrates in it, because things like this can occur. Okay, called blue baby syndrome. I remember there was a question on an FRQ a couple years ago about this. It was kind of an interesting question, but just for your information, I wanted you guys to know what blue baby syndrome was. All right, that's it for this lecture. Again, these two video lectures about the nitrogen cycle are pretty important ones. Definitely might look over that first one again on the process, just to make sure you know that. All right, everybody, have a good day. If you have any questions, you can email me or talk to me in class. Adios.